We're delighted that you're joining us today for a conversation on Reg BI exams and the application of reasonably available alternatives and record keeping. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement throughout today's discussion, and please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen and submit any questions for our panelists. Similarly to our prior webinar on April 27th, we have a lot of time near the end of today's discussion to address any questions you may have. Finally, as with many of you, we are all working from our home offices today, so you may hear some background noises. We appreciate your understanding. To get us started, I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. David Porteous.
Hi, yes, I'm David Porteous. I'm a partner at the law firm of Faegre Drinker in Chicago. I work in the business litigation and investment management practice groups and work with clients in the financial services sector.
David, can I pass it over to you, Ed?
Sure, and Param, thanks for the invitation to join again. I really enjoyed our last discussion. Looking forward to today's. For those who don't know me, I'm Ed Wegener, and I am a managing director at Oyster Consulting, where I provide compliance and risk management advice and solutions for financial services firms, including broker-dealers and investment advisors. Prior to joining Oyster, I was with FINRA for 22 years, most recently as Midwest Regional Director, where I led the region's exam, risk monitoring, and investigations programs. And I was also a member of FINRA's sales practice senior management team, where I helped manage the national examination and surveillance programs and worked on national initiatives.
Thanks, Ed. And I'm Dave Carpriest. Ed and David, looking forward to our conversation today. Pretty excited. My focus will be really on the technology aspect of our discussion thread. My background includes 15 years of really investor communications focused and ways of creating solutions that remove friction and pain relief from compliance processes.
Thank you, Dave. And my name is Param Nasseri, VP of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCOM. I will be your host and moderator for today's discussion. By way of background, I spent over a decade at a Canadian-based regulatory organization before joining InvestorCOM. Okay, so as context for today's conversation, I'll briefly share two relevant poll results we received for our webinar on April 27th. First, we asked whether your firm has implemented a strategy to comply with Reg BI's CARE obligation. And while we saw some positive signs here, nearly 50% of respondents were 3 or lower. This is consistent with what we're hearing in the industry, specifically around the fact that most firms have taken some initial steps towards compliance with Reg BI, but most are still in the early days of that journey. Then we asked about the role of digitizing record keeping, a subject matter that we're going to discuss and go into deep detail today under Reg BI specifically. And again, we see the greater majority of respondents endorsing digital record keeping as a key foundation for compliance under Reg BI. Given this contextual background, let's move forward and talk about our agenda. For today's session, we plan to cover first, approaches firms and their reps can take to consistently assess reasonable alternatives when making recommendations, the importance of record keeping and demonstrating that alternatives have been considered during the recommendation process. Then we'll talk about pitfalls of using manual processes, including spreadsheets and disparate document archives in the recommendation process. And finally, as we did in our last session, we have a lot of time at the end of today's session to address any questions you may have. Okay, so let's start here. Since Reg BI's implementation deadline, regulators have outlined the expanded scope of their examinations and look beyond good faith efforts. Ed, as an ex-regulator, can you touch on what you believe to be the core areas of focus for regulators?
Thanks, Herman. And I think that's a good place to start, especially given, the poll results. And it's one of the things that we touched on when we met last time. We talked about how the SEC and FINRA stated in their priorities letters and other communications that they had that they would be conducting what they called expanded reviews of Reg BI, and that the bar would be higher than good faith efforts. One thing importantly is just recently SEC Chair Gensler was testifying in front of Congress, and questions came up about Reg BI during his testimony, and his comments were interesting, and I think were really relevant based, in terms of today's discussion. He said that he believes that it is important that investors actually have brokers that take their interests to heart, and that the commission is going to use examinations and enforcement and guidance to ensure that Reg BI is, and this is the important part, fully complied with as written. So as a result, you can expect that exams, like we discussed before, are not only going to be looking for technical compliance. Do you have procedures? Are you sending disclosures out on time? But actually looking at the quality of the recommendations, looking at the quality of disclosures, looking at the quality of conflict mitigations, and make sure, like Chairman Gensler said, that they're actually working as intended. So there's going to be much more of a qualitative assessment of programs. And so firms have to start thinking about their programs in those terms. In terms of the discussion that we're going to have today regarding the care obligation, I would anticipate that you can expect that there would be a focus on ensuring that firms have procedures, processes, and training, like I said, not only to meet the technical requirements, but also that effectively support representatives in making best interest recommendations. I think they'll be looking to make sure that firms are providing representatives with the information and the tools and the training that they need to effectively assess recommendations, to ensure that things like they're aligned with customer goals, that costs are reasonable, that recommendations aren't conflicted, that recommendations are reasonable relative to available alternatives around things like features, costs, performance, risk, things like that. And while every recommendation is going to be different, and we're going to talk about that, and that they're different and tailored to a customer's needs, I think regulators are going to look to make sure that reps are consistent in terms of how they go about assessing recommendations, including the factors that they consider when making a recommendation. So the outcome and the recommendation might be different, but they should be considering consistent factors, and the information that reps are relying on when making these recommendations, making sure that they have access to and are using information consistently, and firms should be able to demonstrate that. Importantly, and the SEC has talked about this, that they're going to be looking to see how firms are monitoring activity to make sure that they're identifying potential violations that could be occurring. And this includes things like conducting surveillance and looking for patterns of activity that might indicate problematic activity. I'd expect them to look for things like patterns of recommendations of high-cost products, patterns of things like exchanges, selling complex or risky products, significant trading activity, especially if that trading activity doesn't align with the customer's risk tolerance, looking at patterns of complaints and what is that telling firms in terms of the quality of their programs. Those are things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, that I think that the regulators are going to be doing behind the scenes when they're doing their own data analysis before they come out on examinations, is looking for those types of patterns and things that they're going to be asking you to respond to. And finally and importantly, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, is it's going to be critical for firms to be able to demonstrate their efforts in these areas when regulators come in for examinations. So those are the kind of things that I think that you can expect to see. Again, I think it's going to be shifting from a primarily procedures-based review to a much more qualitative review.
Ed, if I can just add a comment or two to that. And I think to the point you were making about it's going to be, you know, what trends there may be, like other exams before BI came along and since, it's going to be heavily data intensive. And as you said, if they're looking at how the firm is monitoring and identifying potential trends or concerns in their own analysis, both at the supervisory review phase and or by compliance in their auditing and testing of their BI effectiveness, then you know, inherently what we're already seeing, these requests are typically focused on sampling of data of transactions. And what we've heard from some clients have been, you know, focused on particular products or customers for which there would be a greater potential documentation surrounding the nature of those transactions. So whether it's more complex securities transactions or, you know, again, it's going to be attuned a bit to what that firm does. So again, it's going to vary from firm to firm. We can't tell you that it's going to be just in one product area. That's not the approach, but certainly from a data-driven standpoint and looking at it, you know, we've seen requests where they say we want all transactions from X date to Y date, and then they can give you refined search criteria, and then they, you know, winnow down the data to identify and say, okay, well, like other exams people have had in the past, we'd like to see, you know, the information for XYZ customers, and trying to understand the basis of the documentation is for this recommendation. So either they've identified a trend and or a pattern that they want to ask some questions about, and then conversely, you know, winnowing down to the documentation and seeing what it is that you had that supported it to determine the level of BI compliance by the rep at the recommendation phase through the supervisory and approval stage.
You know, that's a great point. And I think, you know, that the evolution and how effective the regulators, both the SEC and FINRA, are getting in terms of being able to do that kind of data analysis has really started to accelerate. When I started doing exams, you know, we used to go out and we would just have to, you know, blindly sample or conduct random samples and look for things that might be problematic, which could be a little bit of a needle in a haystack type review. And when you would say, well, I hope they don't find it, you had a pretty good chance that we might not find it. But as data analytics has gotten better, they're so much better able to hone in on where potential problems are, that they're going to, you know, after they request that sort of broad data and the blotters and things like that, they're going to be making specific requests that are really going to be, you know, pinpointing at maybe not the needles themselves, but where the needles might likely be.
There's my mute button. So both Ed, you and David have talked about kind of the degree in which documentation is required. I think given our prior conversation, there's been a lot of back and forth and questions around the precise degree of documentation required. Is there any practical or consistent approach to documenting recommendations and transactions on a go-forward basis?
Well, it's a bit of a challenge, and I understand why, you know, as we were going through our discussion last time and talking about documenting things, we got a lot of questions about what's the right level of documentation. And it's a bit of a guessing game because it's a principles-based approach that the SEC took. I mean, generally, you know, they did say from a record-keeping standpoint that the rule requires that you keep a record of all the information that's collected from customers and all the information that you provide to customers. But in the adopting release, when they talked about the care obligation, for example, they said that, you know, the obligation doesn't require that broker-dealers document the basis for every recommendation. And they talked about firms choosing to use a risk-based approach when deciding what to document, which is great from the standpoint of that it provides the flexibility that firms want to have to make those decisions, but it doesn't provide a lot of guidance. They did provide some examples that I thought were really good ones, like making sure you might, from a risk-based standpoint, want to document recommendations of complex products. or document the basis for recommendations where the recommendation might seem inconsistent with the customer's investment objective on its face. But beyond that, it's fairly broad and flexible. And the challenge is, from a practical standpoint, firms need to document that they're complying with the rule, and it's kind of difficult to parse out on a trade by trade basis what you're going to document. Not only is it difficult to parse that out when you're training reps to make sure that they're doing it consistently, if you do parse those things out, that can become very difficult too. So at a minimum, it'd be important to be able to demonstrate the factors that the firm considered when determining what to document. So if you're going to say, we're going to document these types of transactions, or the basis for these types of recommendations versus the basis for these types of recommendations, that you document that what you considered when coming to those conclusions. So when asked, you're able to demonstrate it. It'll also, I think, be important to document the, to at least make sure that the level of documentation is being consistently applied. And what you don't want to have is one rep who's not collecting anything or documenting anything, and other reps who are documenting everything. You should make sure through training and other means that is being consistently applied. And broadly, when regulators come in and they're going to want to understand why a recommendation was in a customer's best interest, you're going to have to be able to support those recommendations. And that might be difficult without some type of documentation to support, whether it's on a trade by trade basis or through records or some other means. You're going to have to be able to support those recommendations. And without documentation, that can be tough.
Yeah, if I can add, those are great points, Ed. I think a couple of points I'd add to that, and this is from my lens of having gone through this on the other side, looking at this from an enforcement investigation standpoint, wherein, and not necessarily in connection with BI, but in other investigations that were heavily document intensive in terms of looking at the suitability of recommendations and how well the recommendations were documented, because it's not as if documenting recommendations is something entirely new under Federal Rule 2111. But I think that where BI picks up that thread is to say that the level of documentation, it's not required for every transaction, but it's in tandem with the risks associated with a transaction or the recommendation that's being made. And another point I'd make is recommendations aren't always a purchase. There are recommendations to sell, there are recommendations to hold. And more importantly, I think it's fair to say that, well, how do I differentiate the transaction, the information that I need to document to substantiate this specific recommendation in the context of a 5-year relationship for which there's a historical level of documentation that already exists. I sit down with this client on an annual basis and we go through the account and we come up with some plans for what we intend to do for this given year. And those were factors in my recommendation, but do I need to incorporate the whole financial plan every time, when I'm backing up the explaining to my supervisor the basis of the recommendation? I'd say, well, no, I wouldn't say it's incorporating an entire document if a plan was created or the notes from a conversation had 3 months ago. I think it's thinking of it qualitatively in terms of, your first line of review here is going to be, the principal reviewing the transaction. What's enough information that helps them understand why this specific recommendation, buy, sell, hold, may make some sense? And if it's, I was recommending selling this and we're going to sit in cash for a period, I'm not buying something else, consistent with previous discussions with the client, and that's a contemporaneous explanation that gives some meaning, that a principal would feel, I understand what you're trying to do here, then that may be pretty good enough documentation in the context of that transaction. There's nothing wrong with pointing to and knowing full well in context that the file is kept pretty complete. And so even though the amount of information you may impart for a specific recommendation may be very minimal, if at all, because of the level of cumulative documentation that you maintain in the file, I think that's really what this is going to. It's getting reps in the habit of building the file up over time. So one, it makes it easier for the supervising principal to look at it and going, I understand what's going on in Mrs. Smith's account, but we need to add a little bit of information as to why this transaction right now. And that bids down the volume of what you're attempting to document in terms of reasoning or explanation. And it also speaks somewhat to the risks associated with the transaction, right? The risks associated with this transaction is part and parcel of a larger strategy that we've been effectuating in this account over the last 6 months. So again, you can make reference to that without having to recite it all again. So I think, the threshold issue is getting reps in the practice of commuting wherever it is that they've been documenting information historically, whether it's in the CRM system now, or historically in handwritten notes or otherwise, or email, just explaining it after the fact and saying, look, let's just get in the habit of keeping a little bit better log as to what the basis for the recommendation, and just enough information so that people can understand it. And to the extent that there are more transactions at play, more complexity to the recommendation, more suitability to factors to consider for this recommendation at this moment, given liquidity, macroeconomic market conditions that may be affecting why we're doing what we're doing now, well, then, yeah, the risk profile justifies putting more explanation in. So rather than thinking of it as, hey, what's going to keep me out of trouble with the regulators, I think of it as what's going to be enough for me to understand it for myself if I'm having to look back at this 12 months on, and what's going to be enough so that my supervising principal can understand and review this with enough information without having to bother me and come back to me because I've given them enough information to work off of. And if you start from that perspective, both cumulatively, what do I have in inventory in the file as a whole, so that a person can understand where we're going with this, and the newer the relationship, this is the first recommendation that you're making, well, then more information you're going to have to convey up front in terms of an explanation of the consideration of the other suitability factors that justifies this recommendation at this moment. And then you layer onto it, the product and the complexity of the product relative to the various market factors that you're evaluating relative to the client's profile at that time.
Yeah, I mean, the questions might be very narrow in terms of, tell me why this recommendation was in the best interest of the customer. They're focusing on this recommendation. But, in most cases, you can't answer that question by just focusing on this recommendation. You have to put the context around it. And that forces you to look beyond and look at goals and history and those types of things, and the factors that you were talking about. So that's important. And so how it's documented, might be different, but being able to justify those recommendations in those terms is what will be most important.
This has been very insightful. Speaking of this layering approach of documentation, one of the common questions that we hear about is how are firms with limited product shelves or limited range of products, such as muni bonds, for example, how can they comply with the CARE obligation? Any thoughts on that, David? Mute. You're on mute, Dave.
Thank you. The SEC contemplated this issue in the adopting release, where it said, look, the consideration of alternatives doesn't impose upon you the obligation to offer things you don't sell. And and this is part and parcel of where the recommendation phase, also includes incorporating what the firm's business model is that's set forth in the Form CRS and the BI disclosure, right? You've explained that you're a limited purpose broker dealer, or you're a broker dealer that does work in a very specific sector, and that's your specialization. And so what I typically see in the Form CRS or BI for firms like that is that they say, look, we sell X, we're really good at selling X, and that's our specialization. And there are certainly other products that maybe you may want to consider for your portfolio we don't sell. And so there's kind of an inherent disclosure of the limitations of what you do. And so if and when kind of proceeding to discuss with this client, again, let's assume a new client relationship, right? Rather than somebody who's been with you for 5 years and knows full well, they just come to you to get muni bonds. But for a newer client saying, look, our specialization is X. If we're talking about with you muni bonds, it's because you're thinking of some tax components to adding to your portfolio, and I'm not looking to try and build for you 100% portfolio of muni bonds, or it requires consideration of other factors, what's your liquid net worth, and are we putting 100% of your liquid net worth into muni bonds versus this features into a component of your portfolio. So I think the ways for firms to manage when they have more limited product offerings is there's nothing wrong with being a specialist and an expert in selling what you sell. And we see people kind of front loading those disclosures into the CRS and the BI disclosure so that it takes a little pressure off of the rep when at the point of sale they're discussing, okay, as what we're trying to add to your portfolio is why this specific product offering that we're good at and that's all that we do may be a good part for your portfolio. So let's talk about that. And then the comparison of alternatives are going to be within that asset class or the few asset classes in this example that you may have to offer. So it's not the case that you're supposed to offer the best product for a client in their portfolio, irrespective of what you sell. It's in light of what you offer, and that they understand, look, there may be other products that are trying to achieve what you're trying to achieve, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, and maybe a muni bond isn't going to be right for you for 100% of your portfolio. I think this might be good for XYZ component, and let's talk about that. And then as you kind of cycle through what you do have to offer, as we talk about it, sort of the product shelf or the cereal aisle, and you have less cereal in your aisle than others, that's okay. It's really about within the asset class that you are discussing what's alternatives for that client within that asset class.
That they did speak to this too in terms of the adopting release. When a firm has a limited product shelf, one of the things that they speak to is that periodically reviewing that product shelf against other products in the marketplace, just to make sure that what you're offering isn't an outlier in terms of cost, risk, or features and things like that, or at least knowing whether your products are outliers and making sure that you're assessing that in terms of making sure that the shelf that you have is a reasonable shelf of products to be offering as part of that reasonable basis component of the care obligation.
Absolutely. I'll quickly pause here to remind folks to, if they have questions or if you want to engage in the conversation today, please use the chat box. And we've allotted 15 minutes at the end of today's session to address any questions that you may have. Okay, moving forward, David, in our discussions and actually throughout today's conversation, you've referred to this notion of a quality recommendation. Can you share your thoughts on what actually qualifies as a quality recommendation?
Yeah, so I'll start with my inherent bias as a litigator. So to me, when I've been called upon to help a firm kind of put together the information, typically to respond to, a customer complaint that precipitated an regulatory inquiry, and we're responding to it after the fact, and we're saying, asking questions about this particular customer's complaint, or the regulator may be looking at a system-wide level of transactions that they have concerns about, of how the firm was recommending something. Kind of working backwards is to say, well, look, what information do we have about the transaction, like we were just describing a minute ago, that at the point of sale, contemporaneous to the recommendation, buy, sell, hold, what have you, that there was good documentation, good disclosure, and information collected matching the client's investment risk profile and other suitability metrics with the product recommendation that was made. And I know that sort of bites off more than we can chew, but I think it speaks to all the issues we were talking about a minute ago, which is, in some instances, it would be, okay, look, this was a 5-year relationship for this particular customer that had complained. But when I look back at the file, I have contemporaneous notes of the transaction from the rep to the supervising principal that were either kept in CRM or in other documentation that the firm generates in the ordinary course. Let's say it's an annuity profile questionnaire that was completed at the time that the recommendation was made, or it's a switch transaction report, which also has a data field in it that people populated some of the information as to why they were recommending switching between a couple of different products. So it's finding these touchstones of the different disclosure documents that in those instances may also have been countersigned by the client in real time at the time the recommendation was being made, and or other internal notes. There's an email to the supervisor who was reviewing the transaction who had a question about it, was trying to understand it. So it's looking at the contemporaneous information that's generated on the firm's systems operationally in the ordinary course, given the nature of documents they're already maintaining before BI came along, and then supplemented by what the firm's now doing for purposes of BI to say, look, what information do I have contextually surrounding this, so that I'm not just looking at an order ticket trying to explain why we bought this for a customer that has a low investment, a low risk profile and a conservative risk objective, and very little assets or very limited liquid net worth. What information do I have about that gives me a comfort level that at the time the recommendation was made, it was a strong recommendation. We felt good about it. The supervisor signed off on it. And, can I replicate that by having had the systems and procedures in place, all of which we were talking about prior to your question, such that, looking at this now with only the cold light of hindsight, as inherently exams and investigations are, do we have enough information, even looking at something 12, 18, 12, 24 months back, that I can look at it and have a pretty good sense as to what they were seeing in the account, in the market, at the time frame, given the client's overall investment objectives, financial planning goals, that even with 2 sentences, I have a pretty good idea of what they were trying to achieve in that account. That's the quality of the recommendation, and getting reps in the habit of thinking of it in those kind of hindsight terms of, I better put a little bit more down here. One, it'll help my supervisor understand this a bit better in real time and approving it. And God forbid, I'm called on the carpet for this transaction sometime down the road by this client or an examiner. There's enough here that I've put down here that someone would understand what it is I was suggesting. That's the quality recommendation.
David, I think that goes back to, the early point, in terms of the narrowness of the question, but the depth needed for the answer, and so the question might be, hey, why was this recommendation, in the customer's best interest? And, the answer should start with, let me tell you what the customer's goals were. So going back and then kind of building in from the goals to how this ultimately how this recommendation met those customers' goals. And as part of that, how, after considering all the alternatives, this was the one that I landed on. So without all of that information, which to your point, you don't have to document all now, but you should be able to reconstruct at least and be able to have that conversation, which is, this recommendation fits into the customer's goals, so it's in their best interest, and here's how we came to that conclusion.
Just to reinforce that one point, is as much as BI focuses on cost considerations, right, that heretofore they felt that there wasn't enough attention paid to under the old suitability rule versus BI now, in terms of, hey, look, did you explain to this person, as between this product you're recommending and potentially others that may have been available or within this asset class, what cost consideration should be, so that if you're recommending something that, as between a few different alternatives, maybe a bit more expensive, that's okay. Low cost is not per se best interest, and I don't think that that's the standard definitively from which they're operating to evaluate a transaction. It has more to do with what are the facts and circumstances in any given recommendation that explains, and did you consider cost in explaining this particular product you settled upon as between some others. And of course, there's going to be a wide variety of factors that involve how you settled on this product at between different asset classes, depending upon the nature of the conversation you're having, where you're presenting, hey, look, there's a few different asset classes that can achieve potentially similar results similar in terms of what your investment objective is, the time horizon for which you're managing the assets, the liquidity needs the person has. However, they're subject to some different risks, different types of market risk, different credit risk, different aspects. Let me walk you through that. And so, it's not an over attention to cost to the detriment of all else. It's that the recommendation can encompass a wide variety of things, including performance and return, and what are the historicals for this kind of product look like for this time frame, and managing it, and when you want to get out of it, and wide variety of factors. And I think those are all in play. So I don't want it to be sort of misunderstood that the attention to cost is to the detriment of the many other factors, let alone in performance factors that clients are often very focused on.
Going back to our cereal aisle analogy from last time, a customer may not want the generic cornflakes. They might want, the brand name Kellogg's cornflakes or whatever it is, and so there's reasons why, additional costs might be justified, but it has to be based on what those customers' goals are, if they want the taste and nutrition, et cetera.
And to use that analogy, I think sugar cereal as well, right?
Right.
Just because the high brand low sugar cereal may be the best for their long-term, in this case, financial health, that doesn't mean they don't want a nice big bowl of Fruit Loops. And if that's where they're going, I'm happy to sell them some Fruit Loops, but let's at least evaluate within the sugar cereal, Sugar Smacks, Fruit Loops, sugar corn flakes, if we're gonna compare sugar products.
You can tell David and I are both hungry right now. So
Yes.
And somebody's gonna copyright this cereal aisle analogy. It's golden. Dave, given the Carprice, given our discussion about making quality recommendations and providing really substantive or layered documentary evidence, can you share how reps can leverage our technology to support that workflow?
Yeah, absolutely, Parm. And before you go off the screen or give me control of the screen to show a bit of technology, when I look at how to apply technology to kind of this BI framework, I look at kind of the processes you've outlined there on the slide, and I kind of go top to bottom, and I look for commonality and say, where are there similar things? And really a big piece of this is decision or recommendation support. So taken at a high level, how do you support recommendations and decisions in a better way? And are there common features? And then by subject area, where are there things that can be automated? Obviously, some areas require a bunch of very specific data and analysis, like potentially rollovers or product assessment, while others are a bit more workflow focused around collecting information and storing. The interesting thing, all of these end with disclosure and documentation, really, and that's that record keeping aspect. So, I'll flip now to just given the time, a couple of scenarios of how we've taken our technologies and really identify and apply it to some of those, I'll say, vertical workflows. And yeah, like I said, I'll just kind of very quickly run through a few of those scenarios just to give you a sense of how this stuff becomes doable. And ultimately, we create this body, or David, I forget what you called it, kind of that larger context or framework of documentation over the course of a relationship with a client. So the first kind of use case I'll pick on is that, call it the account type recommendation. And this might be one of those where we've gone through our decision-making process, and we want to put someone into a brokerage account, a commission-based brokerage account. We have a document that really describes that. In this case, our Compliance Express platform, has all these disclosure documents. We add it to our shopping cart. We also always add a form CRS to that shopping cart. I'll add that to our delivery and finalize that. So we think of this whole account selection process as being, there's a lot of decision that happens, but then as part of the recommendation, a bunch of disclosure and ultimately some record keeping. And so once I added those things to my shopping cart and prepare to disclose, I identify my client here that's part of the conversation. Oops. There we go. Let me add that. Finalize my delivery. And so we think of this as the execution of that recommendation. So I'm going to send this out to my investor. But before I send that out now, there's always that record keeping aspect. So not only disclosure, but what are some things that we need to talk, throw in the file, as it were, in the digital archive. So for account opening, let's say there's some reasons why we've chosen the brokerage commission-based account. In this case, client prefers occasional advice on specific investments and probably has a buy and hold strategy, and a few process checks. Yes, we've discussed fee-based versus commission-based, and yes, we have a completed financial planning agreement on file that's signed. So it's really about identifying where do we apply technology to a process that's already there. Now let's complete that delivery. And then, for us, that just drops into our record keeping system. It does a disclosure of those documents, but also all those rep notes get captured in our system. So that's kind of that one fairly process-based workflow with, I'd say, very little special subject matter or special data that needs to be applied to support that recommendation or decision. The other one I want to touch on is our product assessment through our peer comparison solution. And in this one, this is really focused on taking all that principles-based challenge of considering alternatives and then ultimately document, really streamlining that. So I'm going to kind of go through that process where a rep has picked that product, and now we need that decision support. So as part of this recommendation, how do I consider alternatives? And she's asking all kinds of questions. How many products do I need to compare? What makes this a recommendation that's in the best interest? We use peer groups to really carve up the shelf into manageable bits, so the rep doesn't have to figure out what are comparables. So we use, you can see here, the blue bar on the top are our peer, is how this peer group is defined. So on my shelf, and this might be a fairly narrow or a large cereal aisle, to just build on that analogy, we've got 36 comparable cereal boxes to this real estate fund available on my product shelf. And we can take a look at them, and we're comparing them by cost, risk, and performance. Again, these things are all customizable, but for today's purposes, I just wanted to show you how really on the surface, a rep can go in, say, how does this product stack up to its peers or the comparables on my shelf? And at a glance, I can see this particular product is costly compared to its relative to its peers. It's riskier relative to its peers. Again, in the rearview mirror, and the 3-year rate of return is a little bit below the average of its peers. So a rep may continue with that recommendation, or she may say, maybe I can't justify that that's really in the client's best interest, and I want to explore other comparables available on my shelf or approved for sale to see if there are others that stack up better within this peer group. And so here I grabbed a comparable product that, again, visually very quickly identifies, on these 3 objective measures, stacks up favorably to its peers. And so in that case, we can say we've done some due diligence. We've very quickly supported the process of considering alternatives and that specialized, I'll say, decision support data. And now we drop into what does it take to recommend it? So I connect this similar to my account opening. I connect it to who my investor is, so that if ever there's a challenge or an examination, we can pull all this data. We may provide a little bit of a justification, free form. Why did I consider this product? But also some specific process checks. Supports diversification, already in your portfolio, and this is just an additional contribution. And the investor asked for that. We talked about switching. She said no, she prefers to stay with this, and we complete that recommendation. This was a fairly straightforward example of kind of a mutual fund that's got some easy or more straightforward categories of assessment. The same model, again, you look at the whole product recommendation piece. Here's where we can head into some more complex products. So if we grab some of our variable annuities. We redefine the peer groups very differently now. We take a look at the riders connected to the policies, and the benefit types, and how we're comparing them is different now. Instead of cost, risk, return, we're looking mostly at costs. And in this case, it's the policy component, the rider component, and any surrender fees that may be attached to that on the surrender schedule. And I know I'm flipping through this really quickly just to give you that a point of how to attack technology at this. And in this case, we see low on all three of the costs relative to their peers, and this would be a recommendation. Now I'll go through the disclose piece, because as I mentioned, the bottom part of that workflow is always record keeping, and sometimes it may be an artifact that goes out to an investor, just because disclosure really kind of underlines the fact that we've considered these things, and there's transparency with an investor. And so in this case, where we're talking about the recommendation of a VA, there may be a number of reasons or a rationale that the rep would want to provide that just focuses on why a VA, period. Like, why did I even enter into this workflow? And it may be about maximized IRA room, trying to maximize tax sheltering. And then this product also is lower cost compared to its peers. So free form again, and some text-based. In this case, it's a disclosure element. So we're generating an artifact that doesn't have all the advisor notes. It's got just client-facing notes in addition to documenting our record keeping. And so I'll focus. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, just looking at this, in terms of our earlier discussion and what regulators are looking for, one of the things is consistency across and making sure that people are consistently looking at similar things when making the recommendations, even though the recommendations might vary. And, so this would provide for, a level of consistency, both in terms of, the process and the information that they're using to make the decisions, and consistency in terms of how it's being documented.
Right. And like, at least with our peer compare process, it's less about saying this is the right product. That's really in the rep's hands. It's about providing a consistent approach, consistent body of documentation, and an objective canvas in which the rep can make that recommendation. The last part, Parm, before we hand it back, I'll hand it back to you for Q&A, is I talked about all these different workflows and how they start building this archive of disclosure, of record keeping. And so if you think of just the few examples I've walked through here today, going back to our compliance express log here, I can see, I did my fund disclosure on the VA. In this case, I emailed it to myself. I hadn't have a chance to open it, but we timestamp and we can have evidence that the investor did indeed review it. We have a copy of the artifact that was sent and disclosed to the investor, including kind of that relative slider fee. So depending on the product type, that's meaningful or not. And we also have the record of the notes. So what did the advisor attest to at that time, both in free form, and some of the check boxes that we've had. And if you look through kind of the range of conversations we had, this was the VA recommendation. Here's the mutual fund recommendation. Actually, I'll do one that I did earlier today around just an email disclosure for that account opening piece. Here where you'll see some of the timestamps that I picked up on, because I opened some of the attachments at that. So here you can see I sent my account selection form on the brokerage account and the CRS, and I can see, yeah, my investor opened both of those, at 12:44 today. So that's really about building up that, call it the compliance data warehouse, as it were. And so that's a really quick overview, Parm, of how those different, I'll say, recommendation points, how technology can support those through different aspects of it. So with that, Parm, I'll hand the screen controls back to you, and left some time for Q&A there.
All right, thank you, Dave. I know you stormed through that. So much of today's discussion is stemmed from the fantastic dialogue we had in our prior April 27 webinar. we've canvassed our panelists and David and Ed and Dave, and we've responded to the questions that had come up through that dialogue. You can either access this FAQ document or Q&A document through the URL that's on the screen there, or if you prefer human interactions, please reach out to Travis, our VP of Business Development. Now, we have concluded our sort of our planned remarks. Let me jump to our Q&A and address any questions that have come up through today's discussion. Okay, let's start from the top. Do you expect regulators to apply any objective measures to BI effectiveness? For example, to examine for whether all recommendations were the lowest cost alternatives, i.e. expense ratio should exceed X percentage. And then there's a clarification, at least apply some sort of objective measurement in terms of creating sample transaction products.
Yeah, so Ed,
David.
if I can kind of just begin to tackle that, I can certainly say in examinations, not necessarily specifically tailored to BI, but in the past, just dealing with 2111 and the like, we certainly see examiners will come in and first and foremost, they want to understand what if any guidelines, and particularly in this case, BI guidelines, you yourself have implemented. So are you following your own policies and procedures and metrics? So to the extent that, for example, you have some concentration guidelines, and that may be a means of evaluating for a particular product or asset class. Let's say it's VA or another asset class for which you've implemented. One metric they may be using is just what internal metrics have you created, adding on for a particular asset class, and then saying, okay, now applying that, how have you followed that? And then to the extent we're taking it back a bit further and saying, okay, well, as to BI as a whole, are there specific metrics they will employ? And I think as we've been talking about today, I don't think they're going to start at the floor of, we want to see how many transactions were executed in this asset class for which this product appears to have been more expensive than others that you were recommending. So we're gonna start with there were cheaper products at the same time frame. I think digging through the data in that way is, and whether we are seeing that specific kind of example, I don't think so. But I certainly think that they'll use a combination of your own data and your own guidelines, as well as some basic metrics within a particular asset class, as we talked about before, to sort the information to say, okay, well, look, let's deal with the product for which we would expect there to be more documentation surrounding the recommendation, and and it could be a progression, right? We'll start with just switches or rollovers, or IA versus BD account establishment, and then switching to a specific product, looking within a particular product class and saying, look, we want to see your transactional data in this given time frame for this particular product, for which according to your own product menu appears to be a bit more expensive. So we want to see how many of those you sold in this time frame, and then we want to see the documentation surrounding that recommendation across 1,000 transactions, and see how well your reps understood your messaging on BI to determine why this product was recommended if and when there are other products on your shelf that may have been less expensive. So it's not using it from the bottom up, explain to us why you recommended something more expensive. Rather, it's how well were you documenting the recommendation that you made, where in this instance, in my hypothetical, they're choosing a product which may have had a more expensive cost ratio, and then just seeing how well you documented it, and how did you train around it, how did you supervise that recommendation.
And from a surveillance perspective, and thinking, from my regulatory experience and thinking about conducting exams, and they're doing this data analysis, and they're sort of looking at thresholds. What are we going to question? And, it's not as easy as if it's above this, you're safe. If it's below this, you're in trouble. But it's a useful exercise for firms to go through when considering, where are you setting internal thresholds, to David's point, is to say, what are the things that are definitely nobody's going to question, whether it's fees or thresholds or activity. What are the things that are definitely going to be a problem? And then what are those things where we might have to provide, a detailed explanation? I think some of that comes from keeping an eye when you have exams, see where the examiners tend to be focusing and what areas they are. Talk to your peers, try to find out what are some, what seems to be reasonable given, not only internally at the firm, but within the marketplace, and start to set those thresholds. And then you can kind of identify for your own purposes when you're doing surveillance, where do we want to be looking for potential non-compliance? And also it'll prepare you for when exams do start coming.
And the one thing I'll add to that, David, you talked about the kind of the trends in the analysis. I like to think of guardrails. And while what I showed you within peer compare kind of had this balanced scorecard approach, we were also applying a kind of a peer rating piece, which allows you to then, wrap some analysis around it to say, typically, are we recommending products that are kind of in that bottom third of peer rated products? And that could mean risk, cost, return, and you can adjust those levers, but then you can now make kind of really all this part doable, and you wrap a surveillance program around it, because now we have definitions of what it means to escalate, right? Require further justification, a bit more examination, those kinds of things.
All right, Dave, while you have the mic, I've got a product specific question, and it's asking, where do the peer compares typically appear? Are they integrated in the workflow or as a separate due diligence database?
That's a great question. When we looked at the challenge of the care obligation, there was so much ambiguity, and it was hard to get really concrete and see this as something that's possible without a huge lift. And so, what I've started to call the power of the peer is really you kind of break it down. It's something that's imminently doable. It can be applied consistently. And so what that means is we've done, that peer group analysis piece today in what I showed you really exists as an additional due diligence step in the workflow. To start layering on, how do we consider this across portfolios? We start trickling into the higher levels of complexity, harder to make really clear decisions, and allowing technology to give you kind of the definitive support that you need. Certainly that's an area that we're exploring, and through integrated solutions of how do we work together with your portfolio kind of construction solutions. We have all the information. It's just making sure we create it in a way that's doable without creating all that extra friction.
Thanks, Dave. We've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to throw out one more quick question from our audience. And to what degree do you anticipate examiners expecting that advisors review the side-by-side comparison between specific products?
In terms of the comparison of the reasonably available alternatives, I think that's going to be part of what they're looking at. They're going to say, you made a recommendation of this. How does it compare? Not just along costs, but along several factors: performance, risk, cost, et cetera. So I do think you're going to see that. And it kind of goes to what we were talking throughout, is to kind of have that story to tell, starting with the client's goals and how you got there.
Excellent, excellent. So in the interest of time, since that we've got 1 minute left, let me say a few quick thank yous. Mr. Ed Wegener, David Porteous, and Dave Carprice, thank you very much for your time today. It's been an insightful conversation. And the second part of our care obligation series, we hope that folks in the audience have also found this conversation insightful, and that you have an excellent rest of your afternoon. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.